Jerry Ashton here again with 15 Minutes of Fact, which most listeners know by now to be my best attempt at enabling Americans to understand the Occupy movement and its place in today's society and even in our country's history. And there's no better way than in listening directly to its participants. And today's guest, Bennett Kremen, will prove that point entirely for me. The title of today's piece is going to be called Occupy and the Unions, a Missed Opportunity or Just Round One. So we're going to talk to a man by the name of Bennett Kremen, who you would have to be a student of history and someone who likes to look into the eyes of intelligent veterans of what's really been going on in this world, whether it be through unions or through writing, to really appreciate the man that you're going to be talking to today. So Bennett Kremen, born in Chicago, now residing in New York City, is on the line with us. He's been writing in one form or another for many years. He's contributed articles to the New York Times Book Review, Financial Pages, to The Nation, The Village Voice, many other publications. And as I did in my research, discovered that he once served as an associate editor of the old and celebrated Holiday magazine before developing a psychotherapy practice, which he's maintained on and off ever since. So welcome to the show today, Bennett Kremen.
Oh, thank you very much for having me on, Jerry.
Well, it's a pleasure, Ben. Having met you at an Occupy event and been alongside you, both in looking at and participating in what's going on there and learning more about your own background, I wanted to be able to bring you on as someone who would address Occupy Wall Street from the point of view of someone who's a veteran of the 60s as well as a veteran of unions and someone who sees both potential and failure in what we're calling Occupy Wall Street. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, and then let's go into some details on your thoughts about Occupy.
Okay, well, as you mentioned, I've been a journalist. I've had many different types of vocations and jobs because I'm a freelance writer, and they're notoriously independent and do all sorts of things. Sometimes they can pay their rent, sometimes they can't, and have to fill in with this kind of job or that kind of job. So over many, many years, I've done all sorts of things. And one of the things that I have done, and for a number of reasons, is I've done blue-collar work. I've also worked on fancy magazines and what have you, and have had a psychotherapy practice. But I've also worked in the steel mill. I worked on the Alaska pipeline as a welder's apprentice, and I was in 3 different unions. And I've always been very interested in the unions for many reasons. One of the main ones is that the union movement certainly showed itself in the 30s as one of the major influences in modern American history. Franklin Delano Roosevelt and all the benefits of the New Deal, Social Security, the 40-hour week, workplace safety, even our civil liberties have been advanced and protected by the union movement. So, when Occupy Wall Street jumped off last September, I was particularly excited because for the first time, there's been a new left and an old left in the progressive wing of American life and politics. The new left and the old left didn't always get along very well. In fact, they at times got along very badly. For instance, during the Vietnam War, the hard hat, the construction workers' unions in lower Manhattan attacked demonstrations, anti-war demonstrations, that the new left were mounting. And there was great hostility between the two factions. So the bottom line is the old left and the new left, they're like two different cultures, really. They in many ways, they have different world outlooks and different personal experiences.
Well, before we go into that, Ben, I want to remark on something you brought up, and that is back in the day when the energy of people who were anti-government corruption, anti-big business, anti-war came on the scene, they were opposed largely by workers who themselves had come out of situations in which they were the victims. And now I'm seeing that labor seems to be siding more with Occupy, and the real opponents of Occupy are the police. Would you elaborate on that?
Labor has been moribund. They have become bureaucratic. They've lost membership. They've gone along with the program. They've been called business unionists. They don't have a glorious history for the last 30 years. They got shook up last October when the Tea Party people took over the governorships and the state legislatures all over the Midwest and other places, and people like Governor Walker took over, and the first thing they did is they went after collective bargaining. Well, collective bargaining is the social contract between labor and management. Based on that social contract that happened during the Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed the Wagner Act. That made collective bargaining legal, and there's been a kind of industrial, there have been arguments and strikes, but a kind of industrial peace ever since. Governor Walker and those two Tea Party right-wing revolutionaries, is what they are, tore up the social contract and said, we're getting rid of collective bargaining in this area and that area and that area. And it was Wisconsin, Ohio, Michigan, a number of other states. The labor movement got shook out of their complacency and had to go out in the streets in 10 below zero in Wisconsin, 100,000 at a time. And that was really the template. 6 months later, Occupy Wall Street jumps off.
Well, that's
yes.
Okay. Let's stay with the remarkable ability that you have of being a historian for this. You wrote back in the 70s a book called Dateline America, which was published by Dial Press. And you talked about things in there that we would consider to be the potential of what we are presently seeing at Occupy Wall Street. Now, I grant you the flashpoints are what happened in Wisconsin, and the flashpoints are whether or not the police have taken the place of the union hard hat in being antipathetic towards this thing that we call Occupy Wall Street. But this book that you wrote, I think deserves some attention on the listener's part. It's called Dateline American. And at that time, when you wrote this back in 1970, 74, I researched it and I found that there were reviews written on it. And what was interesting in one of the reviews, which was in one case done by the Harvard Review, they saw you in your book then talking about the fact that the younger generation, when it takes charge, that the country will drift leftward and somehow deal with economic and population problems in ways that reflect a lessening of concern with money and status and more for making things right, and that young people are the key. Now, you did this back in 1974. Is this still your belief now? Is this what Occupy is about?
Well, Jerry, that Harvard Review was very snarky, and they seem to have been right over the conservative reaction of the last 35 years, and I felt rather foolish. And said, well, I anticipated exactly what you said, that the youth would change the country because their values and their experiences were profoundly different, and it didn't seem to go that way. In fact, it went wildly the opposite way, where the radical, the conservative right wing got the country by the throat. And I said, well, yeah, what a fool you were. Then along comes that Wisconsin event where 150,000 people came out in 10 below zero for 2 months, and then in last September, Occupy Wall Street jumps off and takes off all over the country. And I said to myself, well, thank God I've been vindicated. It took a long goddamn time, but it happened. This is exciting. Well, I went down to Zuccotti Park in a euphoria and joined in. Yes, I do believe that, for one thing, the youth movements that have taken place since the 60s have all been about a single issue problems. For instance, the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, the women's movement, the gay rights movement, the environmental movement, all fabulous movements, all absolutely necessary conditions for change in America, but not totally sufficient. What happened last September when Occupy jumped off, these young people, these new left people, became economic. That's the first time in a serious way.
Now,
economic issues.
Let's stop for a second and talk about that. When you think that if anybody should be happy to be part of the great movement towards I want to be 1% too, you would think it would be the American student. You'd think it would be the youth. That's why they spend all the money going to Harvard. That's why they spend all the money going to school to better themselves. The biggest joke, of course, is that these students and many other people who woke up and showed up on that wonderful day on September 17th, 2011, these were people that woke up out of this fantasy and realized that, as an example, student debt alone is approaching this month $1 trillion.
Right.
Do they really think with $1 trillion in debt that these people are going to be upwardly bound and mobile? They are now indentured servants.
Absolutely.
So finances and waking up financially and wanting fairness was obviously a key point for them. And you wouldn't argue with that, would you?
Not at all. That to me was one of the most exciting things about it. They call economic the dismal science, and in a way it is, but it's at the heart of everything. And the young people of all the movements I've been talking about, the hippies were anti-materialistic. We'll talk about the hippie aspect of it. We're anti-materialistic. They didn't want to know anything about the economics. That was for stuffed shirts and suits to deal with. It wasn't their realm of concern.
Exactly.
So they dealt with everything else, but they never really dealt with the economy. This time they're dealing with it, and I think that is the historically significant different factor, and maybe the most telling one as time goes on.
Well, you actually did get a nicer and more kindly review for your book back then by a review organization called Kirkus. And I'd like to quote from them. They said, Kremen can be faulted here and there for romanticizing the new virtues of workers and students. Mind you, the new virtues are back in the 70s. Yet he listens well and questions shrewdly, and he believes that, quote, those outbursts of the 60s have not fizzled in a spent madness, but continues to unfold in vastly different forms. So, are we seeing vastly different forms, or are we seeing one forms with vastly different purposes?
We're seeing both.
We're
seeing both.
Tell me more.
Those impulses have emerged last September, both in the old forms as cultural militancy, as sociological militancy, as philosophical militancy, and in the new form now as economic militancy. And that's where the labor thing comes in so strongly. There's mutual interest there, Jerry, like it never existed between these two. Really, they're different culture. The blue-collar guy working in a factory really lives in a different world than a lot of the people young people in Occupy who are college educated and were raised in middle and upper middle class families, and they and the bus driver, let's say, are not. The bus driver doesn't listen to Chopin, and a lot of these young people involved in Occupy don't drink shots and a beer after a hard day in the factory. There's a cultural difference there. But now, this economic, absolutely shared interest is creating a historical possibilities of unprecedented proportion. And in the beginning of Occupy, in September and October, the unions joined in and support, at the top leadership of the union movement in America, came out strongly in support of Occupy. Richard Trumka, the president of the AFL-CIO, with 14 million members, and if you add their families to it, you're talking about 30 or 40 million people. And you put in the Teamsters and their families and children's, you're talking about 50 million people were represented when Richard Trumka came into that park in Zuccotti Park and declared his support. That was a historical moment. The press didn't have enough brains to know how to cover that properly.
Well, there was another historical moment, too. You reminded me of the other day, and that is when Zuccotti Park was being threatened by being cleared out, Trumka stepped in there as well with an email. Tell us about that.
Oh, that was that was my most exciting moment in the Zuccotti Park aspect of Occupy. I'll never forget it as long as I live. I'm in my 70s. The park was, they had announced that they were going to clear out the park, get rid of the tents, which they eventually did. They were going to do it the next morning at 7 o'clock. And everybody was in the park nervous. They were getting ready to lock arms and try to. We know that wouldn't have worked, but they were ready to do it. Was there going to be a lot of broken heads, and there was a lot of anxiety in the park. And they went online and streamed out messages and 5,000 people, regular occupied people, came in from Jersey and Pennsylvania, God knows where, and filled the park up. It was getting more and more crowded. Remember, the cops were coming at 7. Richard Trumka, head of the AFL-CIO, put out an email to all the locals in the New York area, go down to Zuccotti Park and defend the demonstrators, be there at 6 o'clock in the morning. Well, when I saw that email, I said, listen, historians, you better record this, because this is not just another event. This is a big event. And, all right, at 6 o'clock in the morning, 500 stalwarts, AFL-CIO guys, Husky guys, construction workers, you name it, came marching down Broadway, shoulder to shoulder. A cheer went up in the park like it was euphoria plus. And 20 minutes later, the mic check announcement was made that the owners of Zuccotti Park have decided that they would delay the cleanup of the park and that they would not be cleaning up that day. Right after these guys came marching down Broadway, and I don't blame them because they would have had a lot of trouble coming into the park at that point.
I'd rather think so.
The labor movement made its commitment. 2 other times, the biggest demonstrations of any one spot in the New York Occupy, I think in the country, was when labor unions all over New York brought out 30,000 people in October, and they came and marched down and joined everybody in Zuccotti Park. And right after the park was attacked and evacuated, the next day there was a rally in Foley Square. 33,000 people showed up for that rally, and the vast majority of them were from the local unions in New York. So the union movement was joining and very happy about this at that time. The climate has changed a little bit because the unions and everybody was under more pressure last September than they are now. Stock market was crashing. Obama looked like he was going to get rolled over. You know, that the Tea Party was winning everything. They were stopping collective bargaining. The unions didn't know. They were desperate. And that's why they made that. They're not going to make a move like they made without feeling desperate. They're feeling a little less desperate now because their feeling right now is that, well, look, the Democrats have a better shot. And they've always put too much faith in the Democratic Party, but that's who they are, and they've paid dearly for it. But it calms them down. They go back to their conventions in Miami and eat steaks and drink Boilermakers. Everything's all right.
Well, let's complete this interview on the note of good Boilermakers, not stopping people from the Union and from Occupy from connecting more strongly. The title of this particular piece, Occupying the Unions, a Missed Opportunity or Just Round One. My guess is that it's just round one based on everything you've told me to this point. Now, I'm going to ask you one more thing before we complete this, and I want the listener, by the way, to be aware that Bennett Kremen, Ben as I call him, as friends do, BENNETTKRE at AOL.com. That's how you can locate him. You can also find him on LinkedIn as Bennett Kremen. And his book, which we're going to talk about to complete this, known as Savage Days, Haunted Nights, is found on Amazon. So be sure to check that out. So if you'd like to wrap this up, Ben, we'd appreciate it. What more would you add to what you've told us, and what can we expect in the future from the unions and from Occupy?
Well, a lot depends on which way the economy goes now, how the election goes, how severe the anti-union sentiment in America is going to continue. There's a war on the unions. People don't pay much attention to the unions who are outside of the unions, but they're one of the major pillars of the Democratic Party, and the right wing wants to destroy the unions. There's no question about it. You just read the New York Post every day, and there's union bashing every single day. If that continues to erode and threaten union power, there's a tremendous opportunity ahead for Occupy and for the progressive movement. Also, the civil rights movement is hovering in the background of this also. There is a potential for all three, in mutual interest, creating a movement and not relying only on electoral politics. We know that the great changes in American life have come from movements that have influenced presidents, like the original progressive movement of the 1900s elected Teddy Roosevelt, and he went after the robber barons and created the antitrust laws. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt would not have given us the New Deal and all the benefits we have in modern life for the average person, created the middle class without the union militancy out on the streets, and where he finally acknowledged them with the Wagner Act and created the peace that had followed, which had been shattered in Wisconsin. So the potential for the joining of Occupy, the union movement, and the civil rights movement is hovering there. It's going to depend a little bit on how awful the right wing remains, how much power they retains, and how threatened these other two major groups are. Because without them, Occupy could become just a kind of blip in history, just a kind of, how could I describe it? A
footnote, as we know. So,
right.
Bennett Kremen, I want to thank you so much for the time that you shared with us, your historical insights, and your present, very prescient understanding of what's going on. So here's to a successful joining or rejoining of the unions and Occupy Wall Street. This is Jerry Ashton signing off for 15 Minutes of Facts on WGRNradio.com.